How's everybody doing?
Good.
All right. My name is Ed Kazarian. I am the coordinator of the Theorizing at Rowan series for the Department of Philosophy and Religion Studies. I'm really happy to welcome everybody here. And before I get to our speaker, I'm going to present our department chair, Ellen Miller, who wants to say a word or two to you guys, because this is the very first lecture in the series. And then I'll introduce Carl, and we're going to have a talk. So, Ellen?
Great, thank you, Ed. So on behalf of the Department of Philosophy and Religion Studies, I'd like to welcome our students, faculty, and our Dean Vito is here with us today. And I'd like to thank you all for coming to our first of many wonderful lectures that we have planned for this year and for this semester. So I wanted to thank you, and if anybody is interested in more information about the department, you can please feel free to come see me. We offer lots of programs from majors to minors to concentrations in ethics, and you come to the right place to learn more about media ethics. I'm going to hand it back to Ed to introduce us, and I just want to thank Professor Hausman for...
Thanks. And since I'm here talking about ethics, I will give you those books back I borrowed from you.
So,
thank you.
I'd like to introduce Professor Hausman. Carl Hausman is a lifelong journalist who, having, as he puts it here, a consistent will to fail, has worked in virtually every medium as a television talk show host, an anchor, a book author, a newspaper reporter, and as an internet journalist. His specialty is media ethics, a field he entered into by accident. He'll tell you the story of that during his presentation. Carl has testified before Congress about media ethics and has written 3 books exclusively about media ethics and has contributed material about ethics in several other books that he's co-authored. He has presented various ethics seminars for news organizations and has appeared on programs such as the O'Reilly Factor, Anderson Cooper's World News Now, CBS's Capitol Voices, and CNN's Outlook, commenting on various media ethics issues. He is, of course, a professor of journalism at Rowan University, and today he's going to give us a presentation entitled Ethics on Deadline, the Moral Philosophy Behind Tough Calls in the Newsroom. With that, I give you
All right, thank you very much. That's what a nice turnout. I know the reason. There's a big insomnia support group at Rowan, and their medical advisor told them for 45 minutes Carl Hausman to be the cure. But I will try to keep it moving. Moral philosophy in the newsroom is actually more exciting than it might sound. It's something it's something that you deal with on a day-to-day basis, and the ramifications of getting it wrong are just awful. Maybe not professionally, although that can happen too, but the first time you get a call, for example, from someone's parent. I did a story one time on a kid who was murdered in a very gruesome way, actually chopped up and put into little mason jars. Probably you don't know what mason jars are, but they're not meant to hold body parts. It was just a gruesome thing. And I just went to town on the story. It was an exclusive. We had it. And it was TV, and we were all over it, and I got a call from somebody who wanted me to kill the story. And I couldn't do that, and I picked it up. I said, listen, I can't help you. I got to, this is a story. It was a kid's father. It was a kid's father. And so here I was trying to explain to the kid's father, who was saying, please don't run the story about my son being hacked to pieces. And I said, well, I don't know exactly what to do. So I talked with the station manager, and we kind of concluded that there wasn't an awful lot that you could do other than run the story because it was legitimate news, but we certainly could tone it down quite a bit, and these are the kind of situations that you come into. I'm going to show you a few things like that. Now, just to begin, by the power vested in me as a journalism professor, I can make you honorary news executives and editors. Here's all you need. Each of you gets an official reporter's notebook, okay? If I didn't bring enough, I'll get you some more. You need a fedora, okay? All right? You can come and borrow it if you want, okay? You need a fedora with a press pass, so it's right there if you need it. And for handling those tough decisions, you need a bottle of scotch for your drawer. You can't use this because it's empty. It's been a tough day. So But that's what we, that's some of the tools that we use in journalism. Now, I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes. I promise I'll keep on time. I have a theory: the mind can absorb what the butt can endure. I never run overtime. And then we will take some question and answer until, I guess, about 6:15. So what am I going to cover? I'm not, number one, I'm not going to presume to tell any philosophy professor in the room anything that they don't already know about Aristotle or Kant or Bentham or ontology or deontology. They already know that. There are some journalism people in the room, and you're probably familiar with many of these cases, and I'm not going to go through this in a pedantic fashion and say, well, here's what you do, what you do, what you do. What I am going to talk about is how these things meld together, how moral theory and how the types of decisions that we make in news, very visible decisions right in front of everybody, are one and the same thing, and how moral theory has integrated itself into the practice of journalism. Now, I mentioned in the blurb that I put together for this that people commonly don't toss around the terms Aristotle, Kant, Bentham, but sometimes they do. And part of the reason is, in the past 30 years, and I think I wrote about 25 years ago my first ethics book, we did start including those names. And the reason was, we thought, what the hell is the point of reinventing the wheel? All this stuff has been talked about for centuries. People have talked about, well, do we make an action because it's going to produce some greater good, or do we make an action because we have these inviolable rules that are passed on just from common sense and decency and we stick to them? Or is there some sort of middle path that we can take? So that's what I hope that you take away from this. A few things I'm going to show you might be disturbing. However, there's nothing I'm going to show on the screen that has not been on the front page or on the lead 10 minutes of a network newscast. But again, that's part and parcel of making these types of decisions. I want to say one other thing, that there is no right or wrong. Well, there is, but not in ethics cases. We try to define ethics, and I'll get to that in a second. People have a misconception about ethics, I think, say when they pass ethics laws. Like the state of New Jersey has more ethics laws than you could possibly imagine. No ethics, but ethics laws coming out of your ears. But an ethics law is not really ethics. It's something that's enforceable. There was a fellow named Lord Moulton who was a political philosopher. And ethics is not enforceable. Ethics is obedience to the unenforceable. Ethics is what you do, I call it, when no one's looking. So when you say there are a bunch of laws, that's not exactly ethics. Ethics is what you do when you're under pressure and you're trying to figure out what is the right thing to do. Having said that, I'll give you a series of scenarios, and I will ask you what you think the right decision is. Now, when I say there's no right or wrong answer, what I mean by this is, when I first started doing these seminars, it was quite a while ago, back in the days of cuneiform and hieroglyphics, I would give these seminars, and it just happened by accident. I'll explain that too, but I would give these seminars to groups of very senior news executives. I had no idea. I decided to give a seminar. I walked in, there was a vice president from CBS News. There was the editor-in-chief of the Associated Press. I said, oh my God, I'm going to get up here and I'm going to give them one of these scenarios and say, well, what would you do in these circumstances? And they're all going to say, well, you damn fool, of course you do this, and then just walk out. But it didn't happen. In the case of one of these that I'm going to give you, it was like a 60-40 split. The 60 said this, the 40 said, what? Why you would do that? And there was disagreement and some very constructive talk among these people who ostensibly knew all the answers. Why didn't they all agree on it? Well, it's because a lot of news people don't get to talk to each other. They don't have a lot of conferences. News is a busy business. You're trying to execute your own business and not particularly worried about what other people are doing. You do see it, but you don't talk with them an awful lot because they're competitors. So I did kind of an interesting business for a while giving these seminars, but again, I just wanted to point out, don't worry about having an opinion and thinking that, my gosh, everyone is going to think I'm a moron, because Everybody has a different view of these, even people that you think would know. Troubling scenarios. Hard to beat this one, dead baby. This was on the front page of the Providence Evening Bulletin. Providence Evening Bulletin was, well, still is, a Pulitzer Prize-winning newspaper. And they ran, after not much consideration because they didn't have time, this photo that came back from one of their star photographers. Here are the facts of the case. Normally a paper, especially an afternoon paper, and this was a few years ago, when people regarded papers as something that the whole family would sit around and read, it's still true. Newspaper people have this idea. They apparently have been stuck in the Leave It to Beaver age. They still think Ward and June and Tony sit around passing the sports section around and read the paper, but they say, you know, these are family newspapers and we can't put something like this on the front page, but they did. I wish I had not lost the actual front page because the photo I showed you doesn't give it justice. It was huge. It covered the front page. There is no question it was an arresting photo. I mean, it was a stark photo, and it captured everyone's attention, and boy, were people upset about it. Providence is unusual. Providence is, if you've ever been there, it's an older, quite old New England town. They have houses that the majority of them are probably in certain areas death traps. They're just built that way. They're called three-deckers. They have a central area in the middle. When these houses were built in the 1800s, no one understood dynamics of fire. The central was like a chimney. It just makes them go up. And they're old, and they're made out of wood. They haven't been painted. They have bad heating systems. There had been several fires, and in these fires what was so frustrating was that there were no smoke detectors. And in this case, there were no smoke detectors found in the building. The houses were fire traps, and everyone, including the fire chief, said that the death was preventable. Okay, so it went on the front page after some soul searching. Here was the justification by James Wyman, legendary editor. He said things like this. He wrote things like this, and he said it too. I talked with him once. He said, the message it signaled, why did he run this? That's what he said, why did he run this? He said, the message it signaled to the public was an overridingly important, powerful, and worthy one. He said, witness the reality of a fast-moving fire. Witness the reality of the risks to residents, police, and firemen involved. Witness the reality of a fact sometimes forgotten and ignored, that the grim fact is that fire kills, and there was a baby in death rigor. When people are burned to death, I've seen a few of them, their hands, the tendons shrink and their hands claw in a death rigor. That's why he ran it. And the mail came in and the calls came in about 90% against. But he was happy with his justification. Now, that was a ends justify the means type of justification. In other words, we're doing this. We're doing this because we think that the result is worth, in this case, breaking the rules, okay? There are unwritten and written rules about this, but generally you don't put dead babies on the front of your paper. But they did this time. We've seen this in a couple of recent cases, the Robin Williams suicide. Now, there were graphic depictions, not photos, but graphic descriptions of what Robin Williams had done to himself. He'd hanged himself with a belt. He had slit his wrists with a penknife. His family was outraged by this. There came an argument then among people about the ethics of these details. I have to tell you, it's complicated by the fact that California has unusual laws about public documents. California law mandates that coroners are different thing, medical examiners have to give full details about deaths. That's the law. Now, there's no law that says the press has to repeat them. Okay, the press didn't have to go into such detail, but they did, and there was outrage. There was outrage from people who were arguing both ends of the either ends justify the means or this will be the consequence of it. Some people said the consequence of explaining fully what Robin Williams did to himself was good because it shows this societal condition. He'd been in and out of rehab. He looked like a happy person, but he wasn't. He looked like he had money. We should bring awareness of the fact that he did this. Through the extraordinary descriptions, detailed descriptions of what happened. Now, other people said, now wait a minute, what's going to happen is, do you know that when Marilyn Monroe committed suicide, many of you don't even know who Marilyn Monroe is, but when she committed suicide, there was, according to some reliable statistics I can't vouch for, but they've been repeated a lot, there was a 12% increase in copycat suicides because when someone glamorous commits suicide, and we've had a spate of that recently, there are people who, for whatever reason, and look, I mean, honestly, they can't be that balanced in the first place, right, if they're considering it, so this reason tends to resonate with them, they will copycat it. So you see, you had two sides predicting consequences. I'm using those terms because they're going to make semi-sense in a minute, predicting consequences, sticking to the rules, and how that relates to philosophy. So, what do you do with a case like that? What are the ethical considerations? Sometimes you have to peel through a lot of layers. There was a fellow named Thomas Noguchi. I think he's still alive. I interviewed him once, a few years ago. He was the medical examiner, chief medical examiner of Los Angeles. He was the one. There was a show, some of you will remember, called Quincy with Jack Klugman that was patterned after Thomas Noguchi. Thomas Noguchi was very controversial because he not only met but exceeded the requirements for releasing public information about deaths, celebrity deaths. He eventually got fired for it, and he wrote a book about it, kind of a revenge book, but I interviewed him, and here were his points. He said, well, I do this because people have to know about these things. I said, why? What difference does it make? And he said, okay, look at one of the cases that I gave full details on. It was the death of William Holden. William Holden was a network. William Holden was a very well-known actor back in the 50s, 60s, through the 70s. He died in the early 80s. Here's how he died. He got out of bed. He was a severe alcoholic. He had drunk an entire bottle, I think it was a quart back then, of vodka, got out, fell, hit his head on something like this, a sharp nightstand, and bled to death. He tried to stanch the bleeding. You notice I used the right word, not staunch? Good. He tried to stanch the bleeding. I'm so nervous, you know. One grammatical mistake, I'm going to get 15 emails tonight. He tried to stanch the bleeding with Kleenex. Now, you see, here, any sober person would not do that. You could, if you were sober, fall and hit your head and open up a massive cut, but you would either call 911 or you wouldn't sit there with a Kleenex and try and blot it out. So Noguchi said, this is something people had to know, and therefore it was my public duty to put it out there. And Holden's family was furious. The Hollywood community was furious. But that was Noguchi's idea for doing this. Natalie Wood. Natalie Wood, as I'm sure most of you remember, and I think you remember because the case has just been reopened, Natalie Wood drowned. Natalie Wood drowned because she tried to swim out to a life raft, and she was drunk, okay? And that was another predicating factor on this. And Noguchi said he thought, we always have to be careful, and this is sort of a philosophical note too. Journalists are taught never to say he thought. I don't know what you think. No one knows what you think. All we know is what you do, what you say. But Noguchi said that he thought that people needed to know the effects of alcohol and they underestimated them. There was one more case I'll talk about. There was a fellow named Albert Dekker. Albert Dekker was a famous actor back in the, not entirely famous, but very well known. He died from something called autoerotic asphyxiation, where for whatever reason, unbeknownst to me, people get a sexual thrill from putting a rope around their neck and cutting off their air until they almost pass out. Well, he remember David Carradine? That's what happened to him too. David Carradine, star of an old show called Kung Fu. Albert Decker did this, and Thomas Noguchi was pressured to keep it a secret, and he released it. And his reasoning was, he said, Los Angeles is a city of how many million people? He said, I see 20 of these cases a month. So people have to know about this. So you can see that we're getting into a ethical decision that involves reporting information that is something that, for reasons of decency and respect to the family, we want to keep quiet, but for reasons of what we predict will be a good outcome, we make public. All right, here's why I was using these words here. This is a very simplified, oversimplified, but more or less accurate idea of where most ethics comes down, at least in the Cliff Notes version of it that we journalists understand, okay? You have this idea about non-consequentialism. Non-consequentialism, motives are the important thing. In other words, a non-consequentialist, and what do you guys call them? Deontologists? Deontologists would believe that, that rightness is the important factor. There are certain overriding principles, a priori. Some people pronounce it a priori, but a priori principles that you can deduce just from nature, just from a basic understanding of rightness and wrongness. So for those of you who are students of this, the most famous proponent of this was named Kant. K-A-N-T. I get some very imaginative misspellings of that on midterms. K-A-N-T, okay? Kant was a medieval, or not a medieval, he was in the late 1700s. He was a German philosopher. I was forced to read for my doctorate, A Critique of Pure Reason. That was one hell of a page turner. I laughed, I cried, mostly I cried a lot. He also wrote a book called Moral Law. But his idea was that all good actions stem from goodwill. And he came up with this idea of a categorical imperative. And he said, well, act as though what you do would be ascribed to by everybody. It would become like a natural law. So before you make an exception, think about that. Now, over here you have consequentialists. Consequentialists say it's not the motives that matter, it's the outcomes that matter. If you pull me out of a lake when I'm drowning, I don't care why you did it, whether it was because you believed in the sanctity of college professors' lives, or because you wanted your name in the paper as a hero. I'm alive, I don't care. It doesn't make any difference. And there were lots of consequentialists, Bentham and Mill. Just to take Bentham, he lived about the same time as Kant. He was a little old. He was British. He lived a longer time. He was British. And his idea was, it's the outcome that matters. Do what provides basically the greatest good for the greatest number. I don't think he ever said that or wrote it. I think he used the word happiness. But this is what we have decided, okay? The utilitarian principle, that's another word that is synonymous with consequentialism. All right. In the middle of this is Aristotle. Okay, Aristotle goes way back. Aristotle, his idea kind of straddled the two. He believed that, well, yeah, there might be universal principles, but our concept of rightness and wrongness stems from observation of life, from a reasoned observation of what people do. And we have to find sort of a middle ground between these things. He was noted for, probably the first sustained work about ethics is pronounced in a number of different ways. Nicomachean ethics, Nicomachean ethics. How do you guys say it?
I say Nicomachean.
Nicomachean? Okay. And no one even knows where the name came from. It might have been his son, but he also had sort of an assistant who had a name like that. But in any event, what Aristotle said was, follow the golden mean meaning average, okay? Do what represents the area between excess, all right? the road that straddles two virtues. Now, here's the thing. Let me just, 5 minutes, give you a real quick guide to this. Non-consequentialists, they have a good point, all right? Now, Kant, for example, he believes thou shalt not steal. You know, stealing is wrong. It's always wrong. You cannot come up with your own excuses to make stealing right. If it's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong. So if Kant were out in the woods with a bunch of Boy Scouts or Lederhosen Scouts, whatever they called them back in Germany, and they were starving and it was cold and they came out of a cabin and they looked in, nobody in the cabin, there was food inside, and they said, hey, Emmanuel, let's break in. He said, no, yet. Stealing is wrong. Stealing is wrong. It's wrong. It's always wrong. So the kids go hungry, but that's the price that you pay for sticking to your ethics. Now, Bentham, of course, would say just the opposite. He would say, well, that's silly. You're killing people. I mean, how can you cling to such a hidebound attitude like that? And so Bentham would say it's
the average person may want to know whether or not I have AIDS. Right. It would make very juicy reading. The stuff that makes people call each other.
Now, how did that happen all on its own?
Saying, quote, did you hear
Shut up. Okay. That's amazing. All right. All right, here we are. So, the consequentialist, it's the outcome that matters, do what you want. The golden mean, get to that in a second, kind of in the middle. The problems with these. Non-consequential was kind of hidebound, but they have a good point. They say you have to follow basic motives, you have to follow the rules because you cannot predict consequences. Okay? Now, we all know that you can predict pretty much any consequence you want. I know people like this, hey, I stole it because he left the car door open. It's his fault, not mine, right? People can't come up with any reason. I don't know about you. Do you have friends who want your permission to do things, that they know are wrong, but they talk with you? I've got a friend, not here, I'll call him Bob, not his real name, wants to have an affair with his secretary, absolute truth. So he calls me up and says, Carl, I'm thinking about expanding my relationship with Debbie. I said, really? He said, why are you asking me this? I just want it. And he wants me to say, okay, go do it. And I said, well, any reason aside from the Screaming Hots case you got for? He said, well, Doris, my wife, Doris and I have been drifting apart for many years, and I think that expanding our horizons would be good for both our growth. I said, wait a minute, Bob, wait a minute. You're telling me you want to have an affair because it's going to be good for your wife? Is that? Oh, yes, I believe that, come on. So there you go. You see, and that's proof of the fact that if you are the one making up the reasons for something, the reasons for the exception, you can come up with any old reason. So yes, the non-consequentialists do have a point when they say that motives matter. Now, when it comes right down to it, consequentialists tend to win. Non-consequentialists tend to win, or consequentialists tend to win a little bit more arguments in journalism for reasons I'll explain in just a second. But there is a little logical flaw. If Bentham were arguing with Kant about this, I have a feeling that the final exchange would probably be something like Bentham would say, wait a minute, Emmanuel, you're saying that I'm wrong because you say I can't predict consequences. You go, yeah, you cannot predict consequences. So Bentham would say, I just want to make sure I have this right. You're telling me that I'm wrong because I cannot predict consequences. And he would say, don't go off, I just said that, you cannot predict consequences. And Bentham would say, wait a minute, Emmanuel, when you tell me I can't predict consequences, aren't you predicting a consequence? And Kant would say, Grillen, which is German for crickets, okay? So they've got him. They have him on that point. So in some, it's a consequentialist that normally win. Now, having said that, there are rules. There are a lot of things that we don't, let me get this back to slideshow view before Arthur Ashe comes and disturbs me again. All right. Oh. Current slide, okay. We had this controversy. Normally we don't show gruesome photos. We certainly, no media outlet in the United States was going to show the beheading of this poor journalist. But this was about as bad as it got. Now, the New York Post, you can see that the knife was about ready to make its incision. The Daily News was a little bit more tame. But you see, the arguments ran the same way. The arguments ran the same way, consequentialist, non-consequentialist, as they did in the discussion about the dead baby. So the rules. I'm talking about breaking the rules, so I need to define what I mean. Where do these rules come from? A lot of it is tradition, okay? A lot of it is we just don't customarily do this, and we don't. We don't show gruesome pictures on the front page of a newspaper. There are memo and meeting codes that people have, all right? By that I mean a lot of news organizations are hesitant to write things down in a book because they're afraid they're going to get sued, to tell you the truth. You know, that's one reason, one of the problems. I used to consult a little bit with producing ethics codes, and people were afraid of it because they said, hey, we have this, we're going to get sued. The first thing is somebody's going to take us to court and say, hey, right here, right, look at this, it's page 63, it says don't do this, and you did that, and so you're going to pay. So that's one of the obstacles we have to doing this. But there are a lot of informal codes or just memo codes that are drawn up in meetings. Now, there are formal codes, and I brought another copy. So when you come up to get all of your swag, except my hat, there is a copy of the Code of Ethics of the Society of Professional Journalists, which is the largest journalism organization, and a lot of news organizations use their code as their own. They say that they adopt it. The SPJ puts right on it, this is not an enforceable document. This does not carry the weight of law, because they don't want to get involved in anything that would smack of suppression of the press or being party to a lawsuit or anything like that. But the formal codes, and there are many, you know, the Radio Television News Directors Association, Associated Press Managing Editors Association, probably 10 or 15 I could think of off the top of my head. They cover these things: conflict of interest, accuracy and truth, constitutional privilege. Context is one. Accuracy is a big one now, especially in the internet age where things can be repeated very quickly and error can be magnified and leveraged. And that was the biggest change in this Code of Ethics from SPJ that just came out. But these are the types of things that are address context, which is important, objectivity, and respect for people's privacy. All right, here's a case. Teenage suicide. Do this in a couple minutes. Popular, handsome high school student kills himself inside a building as part of a school complex. Now, most news organizations do not run the name of an essentially private person who commits suicide. If it's a public person, all bets are off. But a private person, the rule is, the non-consequentialist rule is, it's just right to give people some privacy and solace in this type of tragedy. But in one case, we have a conflict between consequentialist, non-consequentialist. Editor comes up and says this. This was a real case. Goes to his boss. Says, I want to run the whole story. I want to run the name of the kid. I want to run where it happened. I want to talk to his parents. And the editor said, why? Why? My God, why? We don't do this. See that? Yeah, but I think we should. And here's why. I know a lot about teenage suicide. My brother committed suicide. My brother was the same way. He was a handsome, popular kid, and He seemingly had everything going for him. The first symptom of teenage suicide, which by the way is sometimes tied with auto accidents for cause of death in the United States, the first symptom is that teenagers talk to their parents. Now, I don't know about the people here who are students. You know, you go home and you talk to your parents about your problems, you get the same reaction I did, I'm sure. My father's sitting at a drill press going, "You think you got problems? Do this all day," you know? So you tend to get blown off. And the reporter said, "Wait a minute, we're going to tell the whole story. And therefore we will prevent teenage suicides because people will understand that just looks are deceiving. And when you talk about these things, you have to pay attention." So therefore you have a classic confrontation here. As it turned out, one paper did it, one paper did not. One weekly had the benefit of being weekly, so they could sort of, back away from the consequences a little bit. But one weekly publication, they wrote it about 2 weeks later, using the details, but after the story had lost some of its impact on the family, and it's possible that they accomplished the same thing. Okay, so that is the classic example of what we go through in news organizations deciding what to, because there's no law. There's no law that says you can't run the name of a suicide victim. Well, there may be in some states, but there wasn't here, okay? There's no law that you can't reveal the cause of death. All right, so here's our first scenario, the mayor's son. I'll put this in your hands. The mayor of a small town is a hardliner on crime. He's made local drug enforcement a huge issue. He has berated judges for handing down what he says are light sentences. His son is arrested for a small amount of marijuana. What are the standard rules? What are the non-consequential approaches to this? No, even the Wit, a campus newspaper, would probably not run a story about somebody arrested on a small amount of marijuana. If they did, it would be in a little blotter here, but this was, a metropolitan newspaper. However, this was the mayor. So would you make an exception in this case? So, now remember, there is no right or wrong, so don't be worried about it. How many people would run the story? There's no right or wrong. How many people would run it? What are you, crazy? No, I'm sorry. I just like to mess with people. Yeah, how come you'd run it?
Because I feel that because he's hard on crime, that it makes it a broader issue, and then if he were to try to get his son out of it, it would prevent him from trying to get his son out of it.
Yeah.
He'd be in the spotlight. So I'd run it.
So it's kind of like the mayor is a hardliner on crime. He wants to control other people's drug habits, but he can't control his own family. Who else is going to run it? Yes?
I do it as kind of like a preventative measure to make sure you don't be a hypocrite, basically.
Yeah. The mayor won't be a hypocrite, you mean? Okay. Right. Right.
It's good enough for other people, so it should be good enough for his
Right.
son.
Do you feel bad at all? I mean, for the mayor's son, he's just sort of along for the ride, but it's not his fault. He was born to a politician.
Would he feel bad for other people's kids? I mean,
But would the mayor feel bad for other people's kids? All right, that's available. Okay, who's not going to run it? Who's not going to run it? How come you're not going to run it?
I don't see any benefit. I mean, if normally I wouldn't run a story on a small marijuana possession, then I'm imagining the consequence or the benefit would be relative
Right.
in both cases. So if publicity is really the only thing I'm going to get with the mayor's son,
Right.
even that small amount of benefit I could have gotten, I don't know, I think it's negligible. I don't think it's worth it.
Right. And so you don't think this is going to be some shocking revelation to the body public? Okay. I took a sort of informal count, and it was about 20% will run it, about 80% will not. That is when I use this question all the time. That is about what the general public says. Editors usually are more hardline. It's generally about 45% of editors would run it and about 55% would not. The athlete with AIDS. You have it from an unimpeachable source that an athlete, tennis player, star tennis player has AIDS. This happened a while ago, but I'm using this story for a reason. It is the quintessential story about privacy versus public good. You ask him, do you have AIDS? He refuses to even talk about it. You know the story is true. There's no, this is a public figure. For various reasons we don't have to get into, public figures really can't sue for libel unless there are numerous legal hurdles crossed. In general, most news organizations do not run unconfirmed reports about the medical problems. But in this case, do you make an exception? How many people would run the story? Yes, one. Okay. Two. Okay. How come you'd run it? Okay, you're a business major. Okay. Why would you run it?
Probably because it would sell papers, but also, I don't know. I just would. Before someone else is going to break it, he might come out and say it.
Yeah.
Plus, he's in the public eye.
Okay, this is your business of news, and by any definition of news I can think of, that's a news story. No one twisted, it's Arthur Ashe, no one twisted, who eventually died of AIDS, no one twisted Arthur Ashe's arm to go out and win tennis tournaments and make millions of dollars giving endorsements. Now, there are a couple other things too. At the time this story broke, there was concern about the nation's blood supply. Okay, the Red Cross was assuring people the blood supply was safe. There was a conception that AIDS was a disease that was only affecting gays and drug users. Arthur Ashe was neither. So from a consequentialist point of view, you can argue, and many did, that this had legitimate public interest, that it was something that people really needed to know. And it was very interesting. I knew Arthur Ashe slightly. I sort of shared complex in an office building with him. I never asked him, but he was interviewed about this by the National Press Club shortly before he died, actually, and here's what he said.
Such and such, end of quote. Any informed citizen certainly needs to know the basics of maladies like AIDS. That's prudent, and I find that in my daughter's nursery school classes. The public certainly doesn't have to know as if it were some medical sine qua non. The right to know private matters like AIDS is in the news a lot these days. The right. As in, does the public have a right to know whether or not a pilot tested positive for cocaine? Or a conductor who drives one of your Washington subways? Yes, I would say I'd like to know whether or not that fellow or a woman tests positive for cocaine. I write for the Washington Post and Tennis Magazine, and I know some things about some athletes that would certainly be damaging. But other than mere titillation, going public with this sort of information serves no useful purpose.
Arthur Ashe was asked one time by Maria Shriver in a very good interview. She said, well, journalists would argue and journalism students would argue that we have to have this right to do this because, and it's too bad that someone like Arthur Ashe suffers in the process, but we have to maintain this right in order for us to have a vigorous free press. And he said, there is something to that. There is a very intelligent, sensitive man. But he said, is there no place for sensitivity in the equation? So those are the conflicting views from ethical camps, from some of the words that we use in ethics and in news. What's the bottom line? Well, consequentialists, they tend to win a lot of these arguments if it is the only way to get the story, okay? Things that we normally don't do, like impersonation, okay? It says in the SPJ Code of Ethics, well, you don't go undercover or you don't impersonate someone unless you've exhausted all the other ways to get the story. Now, One quick story on that, because I don't want to run over time, but Ben Bradley, who I'm sure you know, he died recently. He was the executive editor of the Washington Post. He was the one who shepherded Watergate through the entire story. But this wasn't about Watergate. He was a Pulitzer Prize judge. And there was a story that was done by the Chicago Tribune, great story about corruption in government. And what the Chicago Tribune did was they opened up a bar called the Mirage, wonderful name for a bar. And they hid cameras up in the corners, and they filmed these city inspectors coming in and asking for bribes. Basically, the inspectors would say, hey, you give me an envelope, you know. I grew up in a neighborhood like that, you know, and one person asked for an envelope. He didn't know he gave him an envelope, just a regular envelope. Anyway, they said, you give me an envelope, and or I'm going to find rats in the sink, or you're going to be out of business. So they documented all this corruption. I mean, corruption in Chicago, who would have thought? But anyway, and the piece was up for a Pulitzer Prize. Ben Bradley turned it down, and one person has a veto. And he said, no, I'm not going to do that because they impersonated somebody. They could have gotten the story otherwise, and we are reporters. He said, now, this could have been Kant without the German accent. He said, we are reporters. We're journalists. We're in the business of uncovering truth. Truth is what we say we dedicate ourselves to in our codes of ethics. How is it that we can go and lie and look ourselves in the face? So he was a severe non-consequentialist, okay? But we see this in all of today's stories: spying, releasing information that might violate national security, balanced against the concept of the public's need to know about what's going on. In general, there is an awful lot of latitude, though, toward consequentialism. Quickly to get through this is my personal view of this, which along with $1.50 to get you on the subway. But this is what I've concluded after studying this for about 30 years. That a lot of cases are easy. You know, guy plagiarizes something that's a slam dunk case. It's just wrong. It's like somebody stealing something out of, stealing a stereo. There's no ethics in it. It's just wrong. But a lot of what we consider ethics, a lot of our tough ethical decisions, are these things where you're looking for the higher right. I don't mean the right in terms of something you're owed. I mean the right in terms of the right decision. Okay? It's good on both sides. Rush Kidder, who I wrote for 14 years, I edited a web-based publication. It was his idea that there are core values that people have everywhere: honesty, responsibility, respect, fairness, and compassion. He was a journalist. He was an editor for the Christian Science Monitor. He actually had a study commissioned by the Gallup organization worldwide to identify core values, and he said basically everybody everywhere has these values. And he said what it comes down to in terms of ethics is trying to determine which value supersedes which. And these were the biggest ones to him: truth versus loyalty. Okay, do I turn in my friend for stealing petty cash even though he's my friend? What outweighs one? One, individual versus society. Okay, individual versus community, he called it. Well, a perfect example is the Arthur Ashe thing. You've got one person whose privacy you're going to shred, but you're making the argument that by doing so, we're going to provide a net benefit to society by alerting them to problems with the blood supply, by alerting them to the prevalence of AIDS and who gets it, and raising consciousness. Short-term versus long-term. We get this in environmental ethics all the time. With a rainforest, okay? Sounds great. We want to preserve the rainforest, but people have to live in rainforests. They might not find a place to live and might starve otherwise. Justice versus mercy. An editor of mine did a story one time about a judge who presided over a place in Reno, Nevada. His girlfriend ran the local whorehouse. So he was regularly seeing her employees and giving them very light sentences or none at all. And so he did a story on this, and the judge said, no, please, this is no big thing. You can't do this. And he said, He was for the Denver Post, big paper, and he ran it. Judge killed himself. And he was torn apart by this. And he said, well, you know, I wanted to show mercy on the guy. He called up and he begged me. He said, it's going to ruin my life. And it sure as hell did, because he shot himself that day. But you're trying to balance the idea of justice versus mercy. Last thing. Aristotle had this idea about the golden mean. Sometimes we call it virtue ethics. I know there's a difference, but basically virtue ethics means finding the middle ground, finding the path to rightness or good. And we talk about this a lot in journalism, and what I talk about when I conclude these seminars is I'm a big believer in virtue ethics. Aristotle, you know, virtue ethics, this idea of a compromise, it has some self-referential problems, right? Because you can always come up with a compromise that doesn't make any sense. You know, I come in a bad mood and say, I'm going to punch one student, and you know, or I'm going to punch 10. 1, 10, 1, 5. That'll, you know, so you can come up with a bad conclusion based on a compromise. Aristotle recognized that, and he said, well, you have to have a basic sense of decency and a reasonable base of knowledge, because you need to understand the culture in which you're operating. When we make a decision, and here's the big one to me, when we make a decision in a newsroom or anywhere else, and we're trying to come up, well, what do we do? Is it the consequentialist or the non-consequentialist view? We have to consider, to make a virtue decision, why are we doing this, okay? Why am I taking the non-consequentialist view? Well, sometimes the non-consequentialist view is the easiest one because there are rules. You know, we have rules. We have a code that says don't do this. And if I say don't do this, stick to the rules, it relieves me of any further thought or effort. I don't have to stick my neck out. Sometimes consequentialists are in a position where they are in a position to benefit from what happens. You know, if you do this, I'll get more airtime. I'll sell more papers. So we have to think about, why are we adopting the consequentialist view? Is there something else in it for us? And also the consequentialist view is, are we rationalizing? Are we coming up with a conclusion that it may be far-fetched, but the thing we want to hear, the thing we want to tell ourselves? And the last point that Aristotle did make in so many words, he said, you know, realize that there is a price to be paid for this. The decision that you make, and I've seen this a lot, the decision that you make that is often right is often the one that is the least comfortable for you, because you have to set aside your personal benefit. And you know who this is? Edward R. Murrow. He died at age 57, primarily because he smoked 4 packs of these a day. When he died, I remember hearing it on the radio. That was when you could still advertise cigarettes on radio. They followed the death of Edward R. Murrow from lung cancer by a Lucky Strike commercial. Edward R. Murrow was the nation's preeminent broadcast journalist. Some would argue the preeminent journalist of all time. He is most famous for, and a lot of you probably saw the movie. The movie was called Good Night and Good Luck. It was about his confrontation with Senator Joseph McCarthy. Joseph McCarthy was a pathological liar, a demagogue. He exploited the alleged problem of communists in the State Department, communist infiltration, which may have been a real problem, but he didn't care about it. He cared about being famous. He cared about power. He made reckless accusations against people. He would hold up in his hand, he'd say, I have a list in my hand of 100 known communists in the State Department. He never had anything. He never had anything, but he would just accuse people. He was from Wisconsin. I've known a lot of people from Wisconsin. They seem like very nice, cheese-eating people. Where this lunatic came from, I have no idea. But people were scared. Dwight Eisenhower, his own president, was scared of him. You know, Richard Nixon was scared of him. The entertainment industry was scared of him. Edward R. Murrow wanted to go up against Joseph McCarthy, and he had a hell of a time convincing his boss, William S. Paley, the head of CBS, head and founder of CBS. Paley was making a fortune with television. Paley wanted no part of this controversy. There was nothing in it. but he went along. Edward R. Murrow was a star. He made himself a star in radio covering World War II. And the version that we see in the journalism textbook is that Edward R. Murrow is a hero, and Edward R. Murrow brought to life this story. And the reality is he died an outcast. The reality is he died a very unhappy man. He was sick. He was essentially let go from CBS. His show was cut. His boss hated him. In the end, he got screwed. In the long run, I suppose, for him, if he's looking down from heaven right now, his legacy is worth it. But these are some of the stories I always remind people to keep in their heads, that while ethical decisions are great, while they make you feel better about yourselves, they are not often the most comfortable situation to wind up with, and you do pay a price. And Edward R. Murrow summed it up perfectly when he said, his most famous quote was, he said that anybody who isn't confused really doesn't understand the situation. Okay? So that's all I have to say, and we have a few minutes for questions if you have any.